Imagine this scene. You are 8 years old. You proudly show a drawing to an adult. They look at it and say, "It's nice, but it could be better." In that moment, something small happens. You learn that being yourself is not enough. You must improve, adjust, impress. Years later, you are still showing drawings. Only now they are your opinions, your photos, your results, your personality. And maybe you never realized this, but much of what you call your identity may simply be a strategy to remain accepted. Today, you're going to understand the danger of that, because there is a silent cost to living for approval, and you may be paying it without noticing. No one remembers the exact day, but it happened. Maybe it was at school, when you answered something with excitement and the class laughed, or when you shared something you loved, a hobby, an idea, a dream, and someone said, "That's childish." Or perhaps at home, when you realized you were praised only when you behaved well, achieved high grades, or didn't cause trouble. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't traumatic in a cinematic way. It was subtle, but powerful enough to teach you a silent rule. Being yourself does not guarantee acceptance, and in that moment, you began observing. Who gets admired? Who gets ignored? Who gets criticized? Without realizing it, you adjusted. Maybe you became quieter. Maybe you agreed more than you disagreed. Maybe you laughed at jokes you didn't find funny. Maybe you hid parts of yourself that felt too much. You didn't do this out of weakness. You did it for emotional survival. Because, for a child, rejection does not feel like discomfort. It feels like danger. Belonging equals safety. The problem is, the strategy didn't stay in childhood. Today, you might sit in meetings and say, "I agree," when you don't. You might delete a post if it doesn't get enough engagement. You might shift your personality depending on who's in the room. With friends, you're expressive. With family, you're reserved. At work, you're strategic. Alone, you're not even sure who you are. What began as protection became structure. The mask stopped being a tool and became identity. And the more you were rewarded for the adjusted version of yourself, the harder it became to question it. Approval created reinforcement. Reinforcement created repetition. Repetition created identity. You started confusing applause with worth, acceptance with love, performance with selfhood. And quietly, a question formed underneath it all. If I have to keep adjusting, who am I really? There is something rarely stated clearly. Approval functions like currency. It circulates. It purchases belonging. It purchases status. It purchases emotional security. From early on, you learn which behaviors pay better. Being the good student earns praise. Being funny earns attention. Being attractive earns validation. Being productive earns recognition. So you invest where the return is highest. Look at adulthood. At work, you don't just act. You manage perception. You learn what your boss values and adjust accordingly. Sometimes it's not competence that is most rewarded, but the image of competence. On social media, the system is even clearer. You post something, you wait, you monitor reactions. If the feedback is positive, there's a small emotional lift. If it's weak or negative, something tightens inside. You begin filtering what you share, not based on truth, but on what will be validated. Even your opinions may shift depending on the audience. In one group, you speak confidently. In another, you soften your stance. In another, you stay silent. Not because you lack beliefs, but because beliefs have social cost. Gradually, approval becomes your decision-making filter. You choose clothes based on perception, words based on reception, career paths based on status, sometimes even relationships based on how they position you. None of this looks extreme. It looks like social intelligence, like maturity, like adaptation. But when approval becomes your primary source of value, something flips. You no longer act from an inner center. You act from anticipated reaction. Your mood shifts with feedback. Your confidence depends on response. Your silence comes from fear, not peace. And here is the unsettling question. If no one were watching, would you make the same choices? Because once approval becomes currency, you start living like a manager of your own image, calculating, optimizing, maintaining. But every currency inflates. The praise that once satisfied you is no longer enough. Recognition must grow, validation must become constant, and slowly dependence forms. You stop trying to be, you start trying to be approved. And anything dependent on reaction is, by nature, unstable. At first, the adjustments were small. You filtered a joke, softened an opinion, downplayed a dream, amplified a trait that seemed to receive approval. It felt strategic, harmless, even intelligent. But there is a subtle psychological shift that happens when adaptation becomes constant. The version of you that receives approval starts getting reinforced. The version that doesn't slowly disappears. Over time, this reinforced version becomes what psychology calls a persona, the social self, the interface between you and the world. At its core, the persona is not the enemy. It is necessary. We all need a way to function socially. The danger begins when the persona stops being a tool and becomes your identity. You no longer ask, "What do I think?" You ask, "How will this be received?" You no longer ask, "What do I want?" You ask, "What makes sense for someone like me to want?" Notice the shift. Your decisions begin orbiting around perception. At work, you may speak with confidence even when you are exhausted internally. With friends, you may maintain the role of the strong one even when you are struggling. In relationships, you may suppress discomfort because being easy to love feels safer than being real. The mask becomes efficient, polished, convincing. And the more convincing it is, the more dangerous it becomes, because people begin responding to the mask, praising the mask, trusting the mask. And now you are trapped. If they love the mask, what happens if they see what's underneath? This is where anxiety quietly enters. You begin managing impressions constantly, rehearsing conversations in your head, replaying social interactions afterward, wondering if you said too much or too little. Your nervous system becomes hyper-attuned to subtle shifts in tone, facial expressions, pauses in text messages. Not because you are fragile, but because your identity feels dependent on maintaining coherence with how others see you. And here lies the paradox. The more successful the mask becomes, the less space you feel you have to change. If you are known as the responsible one, you cannot fail. If you are known as the confident one, you cannot hesitate. If you are known as the calm one, you cannot break down. The persona that once protected you now restricts you. It dictates your behavior. And perhaps the most painful consequence is this. You may achieve admiration, but feel unseen. Because being seen requires vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens the structure you built to survive. So you continue performing, not dramatically, not consciously, just subtly enough to remain acceptable. And slowly, a quiet question begins forming underneath it all. If I stopped performing, Would anyone still recognize me? There is a specific kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. It's not physical. It's not even dramatic. It's the quiet exhaustion of constant self-monitoring. When your identity is built around approval, your mind is never fully at rest. Even in ordinary moments, part of you is scanning. How am I being perceived right now? Did that sound intelligent enough? Did I overshare? Did I disappoint someone? This background process runs silently, but it consumes energy. Think about your day. You wake up and check your phone. Messages, notifications, reactions. Before you've even connected with yourself, you've already connected with feedback. You choose clothes not only for comfort, but for impression. You phrase emails carefully to avoid misinterpretation. You hesitate before posting something authentic because it might not align with the image people expect. Even your relaxation can become performance. You might go to the gym not just to feel strong, but to look disciplined. You might read certain books not just out of curiosity, but because they fit the identity you've constructed. You might suppress tears because you're the stable one. None of these behaviors are inherently wrong. The problem is the pressure beneath them. When your value feels conditional, every interaction becomes evaluation. And evaluation creates tension. You begin anticipating rejection before it happens, interpreting neutral expressions as disapproval, overanalyzing silence as criticism. This leads to subtle anxiety, not panic, not breakdown, just a constant low-level alertness, like your nervous system never fully leaves performance mode. And over time, this produces a deeper fatigue, identity fatigue. You grow tired of maintaining consistency, tired of being predictable, tired of upholding the expectations you helped create. But stepping outside those expectations feels risky, because if your identity is structured around being the reliable one, the smart one, the attractive one, the agreeable one, then any deviation feels like loss, loss of status, loss of admiration, loss of belonging. So you continue. You smile when you want to withdraw. You agree when you want to challenge. You show strength when you feel fragile. And slowly, an inner split intensifies. Externally, you appear composed, functional, even successful. Internally, you may feel disconnected, distant from your own impulses, unsure of what you genuinely enjoy versus what you learn to display. This is the hidden cost of building identity on approval. You trade authenticity for stability, but stability built on external validation is unstable by nature, because it depends on variables you cannot control. And the body knows this. The tension in your shoulders, the difficulty fully relaxing, the subtle irritability, the feeling that you are on even when alone. Exhaustion is often the first honest signal, not because you are weak, but because sustaining a mask requires energy, and energy eventually runs out. The real question is not whether you are tired. It is this: are you tired because life is demanding, or because you are constantly managing how life sees you? There is a moment that almost no one talks about. It comes after the compliment, after the promotion, after the post performs well, after someone says, "I'm proud of you." For a brief second, you feel elevated, recognized, confirmed, and then it fades. Not dramatically, not tragically, just quietly. If your identity is built on approval, you expect recognition to feel like arrival, like completion, like finally being enough. But instead, it feels temporary, because approval does not attach to who you are. It attaches to what you displayed. You performed well. You achieved something. You embodied the role convincingly, and the applause responds to that role. This is where a subtle emptiness begins to form. You may think, why doesn't this feel as satisfying as I imagined? You worked hard for the recognition. You shaped yourself carefully. You met expectations. So why does the validation dissolve so quickly? Because external approval cannot stabilize internal identity. It can stimulate you. It can reward you. It can reinforce behavior, but it cannot anchor you. When your sense of self depends on reactions, every high creates the need for another high, another compliment, another achievement, another visible proof that you matter. And without realizing it, you begin chasing confirmation rather than meaning. Look closely at modern life. People announce milestones instantly, share accomplishments immediately, measure impact numerically. The number becomes a mirror: views, likes, salary, titles. But numbers do not tell you who you are. They tell you how you are being received, and reception fluctuates. This creates instability. You may reach goals you once dreamed about and still feel uncertain. You may be admired and still feel unseen. You may be successful and still feel like something essential is missing. Because the identity you built is sustained by response. When response quiets down, so does your sense of worth. This is the hidden trap. The more you rely on approval, the less resilient your identity becomes. You start fearing silence, fearing irrelevance, fearing being ordinary. Not because being ordinary is wrong, but because without applause, you don't know where you stand. And so the cycle continues. You refine the mask, you optimize the image, you pursue the next confirmation. All while a deeper question waits underneath. If no one reacted to me at all, would I still feel valuable? That question is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront whether your identity is rooted internally or outsourced entirely. Emptiness after applause is not failure. It is information. It is the psyche signaling that validation is not the same as selfhood. And until that difference becomes clear, no amount of approval will ever feel like enough. At this point, the question is no longer theoretical. It becomes personal. How do you know if your identity is structured around approval rather than authenticity? Not in an abstract sense, but in your daily behavior. Start with something simple. Notice how uncomfortable you feel when someone is disappointed in you. Not angry, not hostile, just disappointed. If that feeling lingers longer than it should, if it disturbs your sense of self rather than just your mood, approval may be carrying more weight than you realize. Another sign: you adjust your personality depending on who is in the room. Not out of politeness, but out of fear. With one group, you exaggerate confidence. With another, you minimize your achievements. With another, you silence your opinions entirely. Adaptability is healthy. Fragmentation is not. If you feel like a slightly different person in every environment, and none of them feel fully real, that's a signal. Pay attention to your difficulty saying no. Do you over-explain? Apologize excessively? Agree to things you don't want to do, then feel resentment later? When approval shapes identity, boundaries feel dangerous, because boundaries risk rejection. Another indicator: you replay conversations in your head. You analyze tone, facial expressions, pauses in text messages. You search for signs that you may have been judged. This constant mental review is not just overthinking, it's identity protection. You are trying to make sure the image remains intact. There is also a deeper sign: harder to admit. When you imagine changing paths, expressing a controversial opinion, dressing differently, slowing down, failing publicly, what scares you more? The practical consequences, or what people would think? If the second one feels heavier, approval may be functioning as your internal compass. And here is perhaps the clearest sign of all. When you are alone, truly alone, do you feel relief? Relief that you don't have to perform. Relief that you don't have to impress. Relief that you can drop the posture. If solitude feels like the only place you can exhale fully, that means your social self is working overtime. None of this makes you weak, it makes you human. The need for belonging is natural. The danger begins when belonging replaces selfhood. Recognizing these patterns is not about rejecting society. It's about noticing where your center of gravity lies. Is your identity anchored internally, or is it suspended in the reactions of others? Because awareness is the first fracture in the structure, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. The real shift begins when you stop asking, "How am I being perceived?" and start asking, "Am I being honest?" There is a moment in every transformation that does not look heroic. It looks small, almost invisible. It's the first time you tell the truth when it would be easier to agree. The first time you say, "That doesn't work for me." The first time you choose not to explain yourself in order to be understood. The first time you allow someone to misunderstand you. And you don't rush to fix it. When your identity has been built around approval, disappointing others feels like danger. Your body reacts, your heart rate shifts, your mind starts calculating damage. Will they like me less? Will they pull away? Will I lose my place? But here is the shift. Disappointing someone is not the same as betraying them, and it is definitely not the same as losing your worth. The quiet courage to disappoint is not rebellion, it's alignment. It's choosing internal coherence over external applause. This doesn't mean becoming confrontational. It doesn't mean rejecting feedback. It doesn't mean isolating yourself from society. It means allowing your decisions to originate from your center, even if they create friction. Maybe it looks like declining a social invitation without inventing an excuse. Maybe it's expressing a different opinion calmly, without aggression. Maybe it's changing career paths even when others don't understand. Maybe it's admitting you're tired of playing the strong one. These are small acts, but psychologically they are massive. Because each time you act from internal truth rather than external expectation, you shift the foundation of your identity. You move from performance to presence, and something surprising happens. At first, there may be discomfort. Some people might resist the new version of you. Some dynamics may shift. But the anxiety that once came from constant self-monitoring begins to decrease. You no longer have to remember which version of yourself you presented to whom. You no longer have to protect an image so carefully. Integrity simplifies you, not in a moral sense, but in a structural sense. When your outer behavior matches your inner reality, the split closes. You may receive less universal approval, but the approval you do receive will be based on something real. And more importantly, your sense of worth will no longer rise and fall with every reaction. This is the paradox at the heart of identity. The more you try to secure belonging by adapting constantly, the more fragile you become. The more you risk being authentic, the more stable you feel. The courage to disappoint is not loud. It will not be celebrated by everyone. It will not always be comfortable. But it is the beginning of an identity that does not need constant validation to survive. And when you reach that point, approval becomes a bonus, not a necessity. You are no longer performing to be accepted. You are existing. And that is enough.